The thing that I love about session-based is it just amplifies the part that I would say matters the most, which is really like bug hunting, right? There's a lot of things that we do as testers, as product evaluators, as just kind of like quality assurance, double checkers. The idea behind sessions is that it's really difficult to be sufficiently thorough ahead of time, before you actually have the product in your hands.
Hi, I'm Eden Fulgo, and you're listening to How It's Tested, a monthly series where we discuss great products, how they're tested, and other stories from the testing community, featuring interviews with tech leaders, founders, testing experts, and creators. How It's Tested is brought to you by Heavybit, the leading investor in developer-first startups. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you would like to suggest a topic, find us on Twitter at TeamMobot. That's TeamMobot. Today, we'll be chatting with Jacob Stevens, a storied testing expert with over 15 years of testing and QA leadership experience. Hey, Jacob. Thank you so much for joining me here on the How It's Tested podcast. How's it going?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here. I really love this idea, and I'm really glad to be a part of it.
Yeah, I really love having conversations with testing professionals like you because you have a lot of great experience. I remember when I was looking at your profile earlier, just being really impressed by the diverse number of industries, tech stacks, testing tools that you've touched on in your career. And so really excited for a deep conversation today.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks. I'm definitely flattered about that. It's a bit serendipitous. It's not necessarily by design. I think it does come with the territory a little bit if you work for like a managed service firm, as I did, or maybe like a consulting firm, or if some people actually prefer the life of a contractor and kind of trying new things as they kind of bounce around. And so it just kind of grew organically, though, for me.
Yeah. Just for some of our audience members to get to know you a little bit better, would love to hear kind of in your words, what your career and your trajectory in QA and testing has been like, because you've been in the industry for 20 plus years. You've been an individual contributor, you've been a manager on different teams. And even 10, 20 years ago, the way that the world saw products, the way we saw mobile versus web and testing is very different now than it was back then. Mm-hmm. Would love for you to give us a brief overview of kind of like where your career has taken you so far and kind of what you're looking for next as well.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so I kind of fell into it. I got into video game testing because I actually had a background in audio engineering. And so I started testing audio video codecs at Microsoft after testing video games. And I don't know, I guess I was a little bit aimless kind of back then, but I certainly gravitated to the inquisitive nature of testing. It's all kind of like falsifying hypotheses and stuff. And I'm definitely kind of one of those types of nerds. If you don't mind a really brief story, actually, after a few years of just kind of doing that as a test engineer, and I went and, picked up some .NET certifications to, I thought maybe I'd move into application development and such. So I had some of the technical coding skills as well at that time. But I really kind of found myself very discouraged. I was probably a 4 to 5 year professional and really kind of thinking, what is next for me? And I tell you, the day that I just kind of resolved where I was like, testing is like this interesting thing, but I think it's not really like the career because there's so much expectation, that I'll move on into development. And I really didn't have the same focus. It was kind of an orthogonal skill set, I think, of testers, even though it's also a very common career stepping stone for many people. And that's perfectly appropriate. Just wasn't for me. So I like this kind of, darkest hour moment. I was like unemployed and I was like, I'm going to have to figure out my next step, but I have to continue to bring in income. So let me just, send out my resume one more time. I saw a job, applied for it. The dude calls me like within 4 minutes. So he turned into my mentor. His name is John Bach. His brother James is a fairly well-known entity in the testing world. Together, they developed like session-based test management methodology, and like the whole profession just came alive for me at that time. And so I guess maybe the takeaway from that for people is if you feel like you're not progressing as rapidly as you would like to, or there's some gaps that are kind of impeding your ability to find places where you're going to fit really well. I mean, I guess it's kind of one of those like don't give up things, because it's definitely was a pivotal moment for obviously like my life, not just my testing career.
Yeah. For folks who aren't familiar, like what is session-based testing as a methodology?
Excellent. So it really, the thing that I love about session-based is it just amplifies the part that I would say matters the most, which is really like bug hunting, right? There's a lot of things that we do as testers, as product evaluators, as just kind of like quality assurance, double checkers. There's kind of a quality gating process that goes on at some organizations, and you may be a part of that. The planning effort and everything can be very, very robust. I mean, if you're testing a medical device, and you can't kill anybody, you've got some legal liability, so you have to be very robust and very, very thorough and very forward thinking. Well, the idea behind sessions is that it's really difficult to be sufficiently thorough ahead of time, before you actually have the product in your hands. So it's kind of a way to do rapid testing, rapid results, and then it's time boxed, right? So that's why it's session-based test management. So the idea would be like you might just do a 1-hour session, maybe even a 30-minute session, or 90 minutes, or above like 180. And that's really kind of like the extent of session-based testing. And so rather than having a test case, you would actually have a charter. Say like I have not used Mobot as a product yet, but let's just say, for example, okay, as the charter idea is I'm going to itemize all of the different user types that have been identified, and each one of those I'm going to assume the role of that user, and I'm going to make sure that all authentication is fine. I'm going to sign up and register. I'm going to sign in, sign out, sign in from multiple devices. I'm going to let my authentication time out, forget my password, things of that nature. I'm going to stop paying and then see what happens, right? And then you just go and do it. So it's really like, I would say unguided testing, but I don't want that to sound, as undisciplined as it might to some people. It's really just about the fact that even if you're at a very robust organization, mature organization, just running through a couple hundred test cases, the reality is you've probably performed checks or evaluations or tests of the product, potentially numbering into the thousands by the time you run through 200. So it's really kind of a way to have like a lightweight footprint of your labor from day to day, where you're not spending so much time doing all this pre-planning, but you're going to kind of do it on the fly. But of course, that can meander too far. So then we time box it, and then there's a debriefing, usually with a lead or a product owner or something, and then you come up and identify some additional charters and then get back going. So it's like a very formalized structure around exploratory testing.
Yeah. It's interesting because we encounter that question a lot at Mobot as well. And in my day-to-day and talking to our customers is like, when is a good time to do regression test cases where you have these very regimented, very clearly defined, this checklist that you're running through. But then when is it a good time to do kind of what you're describing of exploratory testing and session-based testing, where you're really empathizing with the perspective of the user and really thinking about what their interaction and their user experience is like going through a particular product. And there is definitely, I think, a time and place for both types of testing. And I'm curious, like, in your experience, where do you feel like the regression test cases, like banging the same, sign in, sign out, go through an authentication flow, the same thing over and over again? When is a good time to use regression, sort of traditional regression testing? And when do you normally kind of deploy more session-based testing strategies?
Oh, so great question. I mean, of course, it sounds like a cop-out answer to say, well, it depends, and kind of cite the context. But I think two of the parameters that really help to drive that a lot are going to be the maturity of the product, But then also maybe the number one thing really is just going to be the release cycle. And, I suppose that even kind of lends towards your methodology, agile versus waterfall, things of that nature. But if you're kind of really adept in agile or safe, then you might be, if you're a web application, you might be putting something out, potentially every single week. I think places like Amazon, they can release on demand, when they've got the microservice architecture and there's all these individualized components, and they go through their whole vetting process and deployment quality process. And then once it's ready, then they can even be releasing, multiple times a day, even if you're Facebook or Amazon. So that's going to have a lot to do with it. And so as a manager, I have always kind of tied it into the whole deployment process, if that makes any sense. So from there, I guess if we want to get more specific, then it's like what kind of details. You had mentioned some interest about the mobile application work that I was most recently doing as a senior director of mobile application development. So if you don't mind, I can kind of use that as a contrasting example.
Yeah, I would love to.
Okay, good. So it was mobile application development, but what makes it a little bit unique is it was a white label program. So this was for Springbig last year, and Springbig is a marketing automation and a kind of a CRM platform for consumers based on loyalty management, right? Where they earn points and then they get rewards for being loyal to your retail outlet. And we just happen to specialize in cannabis for a few reasons that are not important here. And so the thing about having a white label program is ostensibly the code base is not going to change nearly as much. And therefore, you got to figure that the risk is not going to be quite as palpable. And so you're going to have some options on there. And so the question about regression in that sense was, a lot of people will just stick to like, what's the core functionality? What are some of the most important defects that we cannot allow to regress, which is kind of where the term comes from, right? And things of that nature. So we had that. And what I recognized is when we're doing that over and over and over again, and the code base is not changing very much, we're really not doing very much to mitigate risk at all. And it's kind of a reasonably heavy effort, kind of high cost to do that repeatedly, even when we've, augmented our manual testers, quote unquote, with tools such as Postman and the collection runners, where you can hit a whole bunch of APIs and make sure that all the return values are correct and all the expected failures are correct. It's still kind of a heavy lift. And so I don't like that those things would get stale. So what I did is look through our TCM, and I would sort by the most recent result. And so we had about 14,000 test cases that are in the TCM. And so the reality is we'll be testing new features. There's a lot of exploratory testing going on there, and those things will get hit. And then with regression just being so stale and just recursing through the same suite, those 14,000, it's almost like useless. We may as well throw it away if we're not going to hit that at least, like once a year or something. Like I recognize the risk level isn't necessarily there, but what do we do? So I came up with kind of 3 categories for our regression cycle. We'd have kind of like the core, and that's going to hit like every single time. And then we would have release specific cases. And by the way, this was somewhat holistic as an approach because we had a web platform that the mobile apps were serving. And we also had web clients as well. So, architecturally nowadays, a lot of front-end frameworks are going to be, say, like with Flutter, you're going to write a bunch of mobile applications, but you can have the web app, the web client as well. And so that's what we had. So you've got a core suite. Then you've got something release specific depending on what's going out the door on the web platform or the mobile side if there's a new feature, or maybe like the microservice architecture that's supporting it all. And then, like I said, those old cases that had the last run. Like it was a little bit too much to do everything. So what I did is I kind of had like 2 cycles. So we'd have the core suite, and we'd do that for a month or 2, and then we'd have just a quick meeting and kind of go through some things like what's kind of in the middle is still important. It's a good regression case, but we're not hitting it enough. And let's kind of cycle those through. So we tried to refresh like a third of the test cases, every couple of months. And then the same thing with like the oldest ones. It's like, okay, what are the oldest 50 that just no one has ever touched? And if they're not valid, then test it and make sure it's not valid, and then delete or deprecate that test case, right? And then the next time we'd have a new 50 because those are no longer at the bottom. So anyway, I know that hopefully was not too convoluted or hard to follow for the audience, but that's what we did.
I think that's a really healthy and strategic approach to testing. And this is something that like we encounter a lot at Mobot as well, is often when we engage with engineering teams or QA or product teams, they are just like, yeah, we've, like you were saying, 1,400 test cases, and it's not worth it unless you test everything. But then when you actually sort of drill into, intellectually, like, okay, what are the features that make the most money, that generate the most revenue, or they result in the highest user conversions, or just, it's the most highest trafficked parts of your application, or it's the most business critical, it's the most regulated part if it's a financial services application, or it's a digital health or a medical device, like you were saying. I think you really have to take a thoughtful approach to QA. Of course, if everyone had all the time and money in the world, we would test everything all the time.
Yeah.
You would get a robot to test everything all the time.
Right.
But I think that's actually a really thoughtful point, is you kind of have to think through, like, why are you testing this thing? Why does this particular use case, this test case matter? And that's also where human testing and manual testing continues to play a role, is because even with all the regression test cases in the world, you're not going to be able to cover all of the scenarios that a human would do. There's just too much creativity and ingenuity in that part of the exploratory session-based testing process that we should continue to capture. And a good, healthy QA team is going to use a combination of automated and manual testing tools.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think, Eden, you must be you have to be very familiar with the fact that there's constantly this question of how much test coverage is sufficient. It's very difficult to quantify it, but I think maybe the biggest complication is outside of us, nobody else cares. They just want to know, when is it done? Call it done. Like, it's your responsibility. If you miss something, it's on you. So you tell me if you're done. If you're not done, we'll give you more time. But then, the clock is ticking and they're getting impatient. And so managing that, managing the expectations, and to anyone who actually kind of wants to understand why that must be substantiated, it's good to sort of evangelize that out so that people understand. But for the most part, they don't. And so whether it's an individual exploratory test session or an individual test case, or just managing it, at the managerial level, it's just this thing that we constantly have to deal with. Yeah.
I guess in your experience, given all of the different mobile apps that you were helping to oversee and kind of make sure that at Spring Big that you were able to sort of ship everything on time, I'm curious, all of these different white label mobile apps, were they all on the same release schedule? Did you test all of them every time it went out the door, or how does that work?
No, they were not. So it's a bit interesting. Here we get into some of the concepts of customer satisfaction management, I think. And actually, if you don't mind, I think that is one of the brilliant parts of Mobot's model, is that it's not just a bunch of robots doing automated testing for you, but we as a client of Mobot would get a CSM. So I think that's fantastic because, as my career has kind of grown and progressed, I've just interfaced with whoever the customer proxies are more and more and more, which I think as a QA guy, as a tester, that's certainly very healthy, all the way down to every single individual that might be assigned to a team. But certainly at the management level, I just think it's absolutely imperative. And so with Spring Big, we had CSMs for our clients. And then we had product owners in kind of a traditional agile quasi-scrum kind of a situation, right? So who's the one who makes the decisions, the product decisions? Well, that's the product owner or the product manager, whatever you want to call that individual. And they make those decisions. And as long as they sign off, basically it's kind of like a multi-partner checklist. Test signs off, product signs off, And then the deployment team signs off because we verified that the PRs have been merged and there's no conflicts, and all of the the unit tests are still green. All the tests in the pipeline are still green. The extended end-to-end tests in the pipeline are green. And therefore, there's a number of other things like, hey, did we change database schema? Do we need to notify anybody? Is this safe to deploy? Like we would deploy in the morning when hardly anybody was using the product, but there were some items that were just that much more risky, and we'd actually kind of do that at like 2 or 3 in the morning and have people kind of like on call and do that and just be prepared to roll back as they monitor things through their AWS dashboard and all those kind of things. Okay, so it ended up being driven by CSMs more than a product owner. So what we would do, we ultimately had a really big backlog of excited customers that were waiting for their own individual branded app. These were cannabis retailers. I think, unfortunately, before I got involved, we as an organization began to sell it before it was really ready. But there was a lot of excitement. If I had to do things over again, I think maybe the biggest mistake I probably ever made was not just kind of running up the flagpole and saying, look, can we find a way to kind of compensate our customers and let them know that, like, let's unrelease this, let's give ourselves a month or 3 to really get on solid footing. But otherwise, we're just behind the 8 ball on a constant basis, which is no fun for anybody. But also strikingly common, right? So we're all used to it, so we've all kind of run that way. So we continually added features and re-architected and refactored and extended the code base that would build a white label program, and then we would have their individual assets for the branding. But those were almost just like individual mini projects where there was, less actual work to go into it, less risk, that's legitimate. But it was still going to be a heavy lift because there's going to be dozens of them, and we had to manage this divergence of expectation and needs. And it became very important to have a very intimate relationship with all the CSMs, because if we allow every customer to really kind of take ownership of their app, which is fully reasonable for them to expect, then we would be doing ourselves an immense disservice, because now it's just going to be divergent features, divergent versioning, and it would be really bad. So anyway, I'm trying to pull that back into what that meant for quality, but really that was why we had to get so nuanced with our regression cycles, is because we have 1 to 3 that are about to go out the door. And of course, that really, if they go out the door, that's more controlled by Apple and Android than us. And so from there, it ended up being kind of more like a traditional release process of going through everything. Anyway, so I hope that kind of answers the question.
I see. So even though there's over 100 of white label apps in the portfolio, you were sort of covering like 2 or 3 major ones every single sprint, and trying to make sure that those apps were ready for release, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And so we had some versioning of the white label architecture. So once those were out the door and customers were using them, and we knew that we had to continue to support it in a way at least where, we weren't going to be breaking it as we were making changes to the microservices and to the web application and stuff, that was, a whole nother piece of that multi-dimensional regression suite that we had to do on a regular basis.
What was the ratio of sort of like automation to manual testing for these white label apps that you were supporting? Like, did you guys have, I think I saw that you had mentioned the apps were React Native. So does that mean you were using a test framework like Detox, or have you played with a bunch of different ones?
Let's see. So we had Appium, but honestly, our automation was way more robust on the web application side with Cypress. And so that was probably going to be another step. So I'm no longer there with Spring Boot. We had to restructure, and the economy's down for everyone, so it is what it is. But yeah, so I've used Appium before at a couple of locations. I like to pair it with TestNG because of the test parameterization capabilities that TestNG had. And so I kind of had similar designs here at Spring Big for our regression suite. But really, it was just very rudimentary, just like sign on, do a couple of things, make sure a couple of pages were there. It was just at the beginning stages when I took off. So I'm not sure where they're going to take it from here.
Yeah, it sounds like, and that's a pretty normal experience that at least we've seen in when we talk to different engineering teams and testing teams that, that we encounter, is that there's an intention to build out test automation. There are these great frameworks out there, but the reality is that the tech stack is complicated. It's not as straightforward as with web apps. And so there is sort of a manual testing effort that's supplementing or just doing most of the testing until the automation is up and running. And I guess I'm curious from your perspective, since throughout your career, you've built and automated testing for web and mobile apps. Like, what is it in particular that makes mobile so much more challenging than web automation?
Good question. I mean, I guess the first thing off the top of my head is the reality is most of your scenarios have these valid permutations, which pretty frequently ignored, that I know because looking through the spec sheet and stuff on Mobot, that I know that you guys are pretty well built for this stuff. So push notifications popping up, app switching, right? Taking the app to the background and restoring it. You're dealing with not only two platforms, which that's not a major problem, to be honest, but you're just dealing with at a scenario level, every scenario is a user on a phone. And so everyone is just so adept at their own way of interacting with their phone, right? And some people might be heavy users of Siri and the voice commands and things of that nature. So there's you can look at the core functionality, you can look at the core use cases of an app and its features and how well it behaves, but it's just not able to be as isolated as, like a web app or a desktop app. I mean, with a desktop app and stuff, it's like, okay, the operating system has multi-threading. You can kind of task switch back and forth. And if anything goes really kind of weird there, for the most part, I think there's a reasonable presumption that it's not our fault, it's not our problem. Let Microsoft and Apple worry about those things. But I think we've all seen mobile apps get really weird in those scenarios. And so I think that you can't shed the responsibility in the same way on the mobile platform.
For sure. And so it sounds like what has ended up happening is when you were managing, teams of people on your testing team to kind of work against some of these challenges, you had to pretty much build it sounds like a very robust session-based or manual testing strategy to account for all these different scenarios. How did you sort of organize your teams effectively to make sure that every tester, every analyst was sort of marching along sort of a coherent QA strategy, whether it was in alignment with the web product or the mobile product? How do you actually resource a testing team that way?
Yeah, good question. Well, so on the mobile side of things, really a lot of the exploratory work would be done on new feature testing. And I definitely felt the strain of that logistically, for a white label program. It's like, oh, we've got dozens and dozens, upward of 100 apps to support that's only going to continue to grow. And so if you're testing a new feature, then to what extent are you actually going to give really strong regression coverage in an exploratory fashion over, the core features and structure of the app that we already have? So that was really kind of a pain spot for me, and I think that's kind of the nature. It's kind of just the whole beast of being a white label program is you're just going to have to tackle that. To be honest, I never really tackled that really as well as I wanted to. But then on the full stack web app side of things, as I mentioned, that was where it was definitely a long-term, multi-year evolution to get to that level of regression nuance with multiple cycles inside of multiple categories. And also, we would also cycle the team for who would do regression testing, because it can still be a heavy lift. And so we had a dozen people. And so it's like, hey, can we interrupt our teams less and help them to stay focused on what they're, assigned to do, what they love to do. Most people want to look at the new stuff. It can get pretty boring, right? So just like, and to keep your vigilance up on regression testing, that is definitely a challenge. So we would kind of just build up a schedule of like 4 to 6 weeks and just kind of rotate through people so that basically about once a month, they're going to be on the horn to put a good, half a day in on regression so that we can sign off and deploy, and then they're back to work as usual.
Do you actually think it's going to be possible to get to a point where mobile automation testing frameworks are going to be as effective and efficient and easy to use as what you are using for Cypress for web automation? Do you think we're going to get to that point with mobile?
In a way, I feel like we have, but in a way, I feel like it's not sufficient, and it probably never will be. And again, I have to say, I think that's one of the strong advantages that you're bringing with Mobot, with your own driver, but then having that full stack, capability, which is the fullest of stacks, right? Because it's all the way through the touch kit. So you can't do any better than that. And because the reason, I guess one thing that we really haven't touched on that's unique in the mobile world is the tiers of devices, like device compatibility, OS version compatibility matrix is a beast compared to the web world, compared to, I was doing desktop testing and then like web 1.0 testing, as you mentioned, ages ago, decades ago. But in the mobile world, it's like, okay, a lot of people are going to support tier 1 and tier 2 of devices. And honestly, I would usually just let like browser stack define that for me and say, okay, guys, we're going to do tier 1, 50% of tier 2 and cycle through them, alternate back and forth to kind of broaden your coverage. But very quickly, like if you go any deeper than that, the cost and time just becomes absolutely cost prohibitive. Hardly anybody does it unless you're huge, like Facebook and Twitter or something. But the risk just grows and grows and grows as well, right? So I think the most practical reality is the vast majority of product owners and organizations out there just crowdsource to their users. And very few people actually care about device-specific bugs until someone like logs a ticket, like, please, I can't get the damn thing to work. Can you do something about it? I mean, if they're a paying customer, boom, you got CSMs or whatever, and that's going to get rectified. But that is like, I really feel like the whole industry is just not sufficiently solved that. Because like the deeper you go, the more expensive it gets. And it's just how much discipline do you have to actually kind of chase that level of quality? And so, so I love what you guys are offering in Mobot to be able to tackle that, because it's really kind of untapped everywhere else, I think.
Yeah, I think historically it has been so challenging to, make sure you corral all of the right devices that match your demographic, your users, your customers, and how they're interacting with your mobile product. And I think part of our thesis at Mobot is we think this is a problem that's going to get more exciting, more painful to try to wrangle. But I think that's also what's exciting is that hardware is easier than ever for someone to build their own OS, for someone to build their own mobile phone. And right now it's iOS and Android, but 10 years ago, it was Windows Mobile and BlackBerry were all the rage. And I kind of wonder, like, what is the next 5-10 years going to look like? I think there's going to be more opportunity to test.
Right. Who knows? Absolutely. That's such a great point. And I mean, a lot of people are going to presume that, oh yeah, over time, things are going to kind of solidify and it's going to get more stable. It's going to get a little bit easier. Those are some of the ideas with like, yes, React Native is kind of taking over the world. Well, React is taking over the world. JavaScript's taking over the world, and that's fantastic. But those are also a testimony that every couple of years, there's some new hotness, some new JavaScript framework comes up and just takes over everything. I love that you can write once and deploy to 2 platforms with React Native. That's great. You're also, compromising on a number of other fronts, because if you're going to have TypeScript that like compiles into React Native, which actually kind of compiles into C, and the security is just not there. It's just not, it's not robust. It's still very, very young. And so that's great to kind of expect that a roadmap is going to solidify, but then look at what everyone's experience is with USB. Like now people are pretty much used to USB-C, but of course, there was like a million products that were manufactured with those USB-A plugs, just assuming that nothing's ever going to change. And, Apple will kind of force people's hands on all sorts of different new hardware standards. And a lot of people are like, no, okay, I understand it's better, but that's kind of like this problem. And then, like you're saying, like before you know it, those old standards are just gone. So really it's like, no, none of us can ever rest on our laurels. We got to stay on our toes the whole time.
I guess final question for me is, what do you think a testing professional can do, an engineering professional can do to stay ahead of all of these evolving technologies, these frameworks? There's more different automation tools coming out all the time. Like in your experience, what would you recommend for our audience to kind of, stay agile?
That is a great question. I wish I had a really good answer because I can't think of anything better than just do your best to stay abreast, but also probably know where you're going or where you're wanting to go. I think there's probably some room for some of us to be kind of jack of all trade generalists. But over time, like for example, the cloud, I was up in Seattle for 24 years. I saw the cloud mature, but I was doing mobile the whole time, So like, I am not a cloud expert. I don't even know if I'm a mobile expert, but technology is just too big to take on everything and to be an expert or to be, just to have like the bleeding edge skills and to do the things that are the most in demand. So I think chances are as you progress, you're going to kind of find your niche. It might be web, might be cloud, might be mobile, might be whatever, might be games. And they kind of each come with their own little dynamics and stuff. And so that's going to continue to change, but at least it's manageable. Staying up to date is kind of manageable. But if you're resisting that, I don't know, I guess I might ask why. It might kind of, if you're looking for a job and you're like, oh man, they always need all these cloud technologies, but then you're looking for another job and, oh man, they need to have some like strong mobile experience. That's just kind of what people do. The specialization, it ain't just for the insects. I think it's kind of for us as well.
Yeah, I'm excited. I think in the next few years, the way we think about test case management, test case design, automation, physical testing, when humans should play a role in the testing process. I think, there's so many great tools and solutions that are coming onto the market as our different OS versions and Apple and Android are evolving too. And I'm just kind of, along for the ride and really excited to see what comes next, because I think more than ever before, there's just new ideas and just like a lot of fresh innovation coming out. I think in the last decade, for a while, there wasn't a lot going on in the testing space. I think there were a couple of big players in testing solutions, but I think I'm hearing about new opportunities and new ideas all the time. And especially with what's been coming out with like GPT, I'm curious to see how that will impact our industry and make testing easier for, automation and manual testing.
Yeah, same here. I love it.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob, for taking the time to join me on our podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation and just kind of learning more about how your team and the processes that you built at Spring Big and just throughout your career. I think it's, you have a long and very fruitful career and, I'm sure much more to come. But yeah, I was really appreciated you sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you so much. The pleasure is all mine.
That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, find us on Twitter at Team Mobot. That's TEAMMOBOT. This show is brought to you by Heavybit, the leading investor in developer-first startups. To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com.